There's a gorilla in a room, and she just ripped a steel sink off the wall. Her name is Koko. She's been living at the Gorilla Foundation in California, and for years, researchers have been teaching her American Sign Language. And she's been using it. Not perfectly, not like a human, but enough. Enough to hold a conversation. Enough to tell you what she wants for breakfast. Enough, it turns out, to tell you something that isn't true. When her caretaker walks in and sees the sink on the floor, Koko does something immediate. She points across the room. She signs the name of her human trainer, a man who wasn't even there. Her expression is calm. Her hands are steady. She maintains this completely, without flinching, the way you maintain a story when you've already committed to it. The sink is on the floor. The trainer is being blamed, and Koko is waiting to see if it works. Now, here's the thing. You could watch that and laugh, a gorilla playing dumb, classic, and move on with your life. But if you stop and actually look at what just happened, the floor drops out a little. Because for Koko to do that, she would have had to know that she did something wrong. She would have had to understand that her caretaker didn't see it happen. She would have had to choose a specific name to sign, not just any name, the trainer's name, and then hold that story steady under pressure. That is not a reflex. That is not camouflage. That is not a stick insect that happened to evolve a twig-shaped body over 1 million generations without ever deciding anything. That is a cover story, which, honestly, is a sentence I did not expect to write about a gorilla. But here we are. So the question, the one that's been quietly unsettling researchers for decades, is whether what Koko did was actually a lie. And the reason that question is harder than it sounds isn't because gorillas are complicated. It's because lying is complicated. The real version, the one that requires something going on inside a mind, is one of the most cognitively demanding things a brain can do. And we've spent a very long time assuming that only one species on Earth could manage it. The evidence is starting to make that assumption look a little shaky. Before we go any further, we need to draw a line. Because the word deception gets thrown at animals constantly, and most of the time it doesn't mean what we think it means. Take a stick insect. It looks exactly like a twig, same color, same texture, same slightly irregular shape. It even sways gently when the wind moves through the branches around it. If a bird flies past and doesn't eat it, you might say the stick insect fooled the bird. But the stick insect didn't do anything. It didn't choose that body. It didn't notice the bird and decide to hold still. Over millions of generations, the ones that looked less like twigs got eaten, and the ones that looked more like twigs didn't. That's it. That's the whole story. The stick insect is not lying. It is simply the shape that survived. This matters because the moment you start calling camouflage a lie, the word stops meaning anything useful. So what would actual deception require? Not just looking like something you're not, but actively, deliberately creating a false belief in another mind. And that second part is where things get genuinely strange. Because to do that, you need to understand that the other animal has a mind, that it holds beliefs, that those beliefs can be wrong, and that you can be the reason they're wrong. Researchers have a name for this capacity: theory of mind, the ability to model what another being thinks, knows, and expects, as a thing separate from what you think, know, and expect. It sounds almost obvious when you describe it, but it's actually one of the most sophisticated cognitive operations we know of. For decades, really up until the late 20th century, the scientific consensus was clean and comfortable. Humans had it, animals didn't. End of story. David Premack and Guy Woodruff put the question formally on the table in 1978, studying chimpanzees. And even then, the debate was mostly about whether the experiments were good enough to prove the point. The assumption underneath stayed firm. That assumption is now considerably less firm. Because if theory of mind is the threshold, if that's what separates a stick insect doing nothing from a gorilla pointing at someone else, then the question becomes, which animals are actually clearing it? And the answer, when you look at the evidence, is a list that keeps getting longer and more uncomfortable the closer you look. A raven finds food. Let's say it's a decent catch, enough to matter. And it knows another raven is watching from nearby, because ravens always know who's watching. So it flies to a spot, makes a big show of digging, tucks something in, pats the ground down. Very convincing. Then it flies to a completely different location and hides the actual food there, quietly, with none of the performance. Cambridge researchers documented this in the early 2000s. Ravens who had previously been thieves themselves, who knew from experience that other ravens steal, were significantly more likely to run decoy caches when they were being observed. When no one was watching, they just hid the food. The theatrics were specifically for the audience. A raven running a con. Now, female fireflies of the genus Photirus have learned the precise flash pattern of a completely different species, Photinus males searching for mates. The signal is species-specific, like a password. Photirus females use it anyway, flashing the right code at the right interval to lure Photinus males in close. Not for mating, to eat them. The firefly learned another species' language and turned it into a trap, which is either deeply impressive or deeply unsettling, depending on your mood. If this is the kind of thing that gets you, drop a like, leave a comment. It genuinely helps. Anyway, the chimp case is the one that stays with me. A subordinate male is out with a group and he spots a hidden food source, fruit, buried just under the surface. The dominant male is 20 feet away, and the subordinate does nothing. No excitement, no glance toward the food, no change in posture whatsoever. He waits. When the dominant male eventually wanders off, the subordinate walks directly to the exact spot and digs it up. He suppressed every natural reaction his body wanted to have. The quickened movement, the focused gaze, the small physical tells that would have given him away, and held a neutral expression until the coast was clear. Researchers at multiple field sites have documented this pattern repeatedly. That's not instinct. Instinct doesn't require you to override instinct. That's one mind actively managing what another mind is allowed to see. So here's the question that actually matters. If animals can do all of this, the decoy, the stolen signal, the controlled face, what does that require of the brain behind it? Lying is actually a 4-step problem, and when you lay the steps out, it becomes clear why it's such a strange thing to find anywhere outside of a human skull. First, you have to know that you know something. That sounds trivial, but it isn't. It requires a model of your own mental state, which is already more than most nervous systems can manage. Second, you have to understand that the other being does not know that thing. Their mind is different from yours, running on different information. Third, you have to predict how they'll behave based on that gap, what they'll do because they don't know what you know. And fourth, you have to choose an action that keeps the gap open. That maintains the false picture in their head. 4 steps, each one building on the last. The whole chain has to run in sequence before the behavior even starts. Gordon Gallup Jr. developed the mirror test in 1970 as a rough probe for the first step, self-awareness. The setup is simple. Put a mark on an animal's face while it's asleep, then show it a mirror. Does it touch the mark on its own face, understanding the reflection is itself? Or does it treat the mirror like another animal? Most species treat it like another animal. Chimps, though, dolphins, elephants, and certain corvids, ravens, jays, which, given everything we've just covered, feels less like a coincidence and more like a pattern quietly introducing itself. Passing the mirror test doesn't prove theory of mind. I want to be clear about that. Researchers are clear about that. It's a measure of self-recognition, not of mind reading. But you can't model another being's beliefs if you don't have a stable model of your own existence first. It's a prerequisite, not a proof. A necessary condition, not a sufficient one. What's striking is how short the list is. Out of the tens of thousands of animal species on Earth, the ones that reliably pass can be counted without running out of fingers. And they're almost exactly the same species showing up in the deception studies. The ravens, the chimps, the dolphins, who have their own documented cases of leading researchers away from things they didn't want found. The honest answer is that we don't fully know where the line is, or whether there even is one clean line. But the cluster keeps tightening. The same animals showing up in the same experiments, clearing the same bars. A chimp sitting still in a field, face neutral, waiting. That image keeps coming back to me. Because whatever is happening behind those eyes in that moment, it is not nothing. Here's the part that flips the whole story over. We've been asking why animals can lie, but the more interesting question, the one that changes the frame entirely, is why we can. Where did the human capacity for deception actually come from? Because the standard answer is that human intelligence grew to solve survival problems, finding food, avoiding predators, managing the physical environment. Big brain, better toolkit, longer life. Clean story. Robin Dunbar at Oxford started pulling on a different thread in the 1990s, and what came out is called the social brain hypothesis. The short version? Our brains didn't get big to deal with nature. They got big to deal with each other. Living in large, complex social groups turns out to be a genuinely brutal cognitive problem. You need to track who's allied with whom, who owes whom a favor, who's likely to betray you, who's likely to help you, and under what conditions either of those might flip. You need to model other minds, not just what people are doing, but what they believe, what they expect, what they think you believe. And you need to do all of this in real time across a group of dozens of individuals, while also finding food and not getting eaten. That is an enormous amount of simultaneous computation. And Dunbar's argument is that it was precisely this pressure, the social pressure, the need to cooperate and compete and negotiate and, yes, deceive, that drove the expansion of the primate neocortex over millions of years. Which means lying didn't come after intelligence. The need to deceive and the parallel need to detect deception in others may have been one of the primary engines that built the human brain in the first place. The arms race between the liar and the lie detector, running for millions of years, each side pushing the other to get faster and more precise. Now look back at the ravens, the chimps, the fireflies running a stolen signal. These are all animals living in complex social environments, hierarchies, alliances, competition for resources, where modeling another mind gives you a measurable advantage, where the animal that can predict what the other animal believes will, on average, eat more and survive longer. If Dunbar's hypothesis is right, we may not be looking at animals doing a pale imitation of something uniquely human. We may be watching the same evolutionary pressure, the same ancient engine running in other lineages, building the same cognitive machinery piece by piece. The human brain and the raven brain arrived at similar solutions from very different starting points. That's either a coincidence or it's telling us something about what intelligence is actually for. Slow down for a second, because this is where it stops being just a science question. If a chimp can deliberately suppress its own reactions to control what another animal believes, if it can hold a model of another mind inside its head and manipulate that model in real time, then something is happening in there. Something that we don't have a clean word for and haven't fully looked at. Not a reflex, not a program running on a loop. Something that, if we saw it in a human child, we would call thought. We've built entire systems on the assumption that this isn't happening. Legal systems in most of the world treat animals as property, objects with owners, not subjects with interests. Agricultural systems process billions of animals annually on the premise that their inner lives, whatever they are, don't generate the kind of experience that demands moral weight. Scientific research frameworks have historically required extraordinary justification to extend protections beyond a very short list of species, all of it resting ultimately on a single load-bearing assumption, that the gap between human minds and animal minds is wide enough and clear enough to support the weight of those decisions. That assumption was never as solid as it looked, and the deception research doesn't strengthen it. This isn't an argument for any particular policy. I want to be careful here. The science doesn't hand you a ready-made conclusion about what to do, but it does hand you a question you can't unask. If the chimp waiting in that field has a model of another mind, if it understands in some functional sense that the dominant male has beliefs that can be managed, then there is a perspective in there, a point of view, something it is like to be that animal in that moment, running that calculation, waiting. We don't know how deep it goes. That's the honest answer. We don't have tools precise enough to measure the interior of another species' experience, and we probably won't for a long time. But we don't know is a very different position from there's nothing there. And for a very long time, we've been acting on the second one while the evidence has been quietly building a case for the first. A raven lands in a field, looks around, and runs a decoy. A chimp keeps its face still. A gorilla points across the room and signs someone else's name. Each of those moments is an animal doing something that requires, at minimum, a working model of another mind. What we do with that, what it asks of us, is a question the science opens but doesn't close. Koko died in 2018. She was 46 years old, which is a long life for a gorilla, and she spent most of it in the company of humans who were genuinely trying to understand what was happening inside her mind. The sink incident, the blamed trainer, the steady hands, the maintained story, was never definitively resolved as a lie in the strict scientific sense. Researchers still argue about it. The debate is still open. But here's what I keep coming back to. The fact that it's debatable at all. The fact that a gorilla's behavior in a room in California sits close enough to the definition of intentional deception that serious scientists have spent serious time arguing about which side of the line it falls on. That fact alone is telling you something. Not about Koko specifically, about the line itself. We drew that line to separate us from everything else. Human minds on one side, animal minds on the other. A clean gap in between. And for a long time it held, or seemed to. But the more carefully researchers have looked, at ravens running decoys, at chimps keeping their faces still, at the four-step cognitive chain that deception actually requires, the more the line has started to look less like a wall and more like a gradient, a slow fade, a spectrum that we happen to be standing at one end of, looking back. And the animals aren't at the other end. They're closer than we thought. Some of them are much closer. Which brings it back to you, right now, watching this. You've probably seen an animal do something that stopped you. A dog that seemed to know it had done something wrong before you said a word. A crow that watched you from a wire with what felt uncomfortably like assessment. A cat that very clearly understood the situation and chose, with what appeared to be full awareness, not to cooperate. You probably filed it under funny animal behavior and moved on. Maybe file it a little differently now. Not because animals are secretly humans in disguise, or because every clever-looking behavior is a window into a rich inner life. The science doesn't say that, and neither do I. But because the question of what's actually going on in those moments is genuinely open and genuinely worth sitting with. If you've ever watched an animal do something that felt almost too calculated, too deliberate, too aware, it'd actually love to know what it was. Leave it in the comments. Because if this video has done anything, I hope it's made that memory feel a little less like a quirky anecdote and a little more like evidence.